Hey guys, Rich here. Today I want to walk you through the install of the Scaggs Moto Designs rack for the back of the Honda CRF450L. This is my Honda CRF450L, if you haven't caught any of my previous videos. Jared and I actually used this bike to design the prototype parts for this new rack, and he's now spinning out the production level parts for this bike, and he's actually been shipping them for a little while now. So if you weren't aware of that, definitely check out his site. I will link it down below. But I wanted to put this video together just to give you an idea of how easy it is to install this rack on the bike. It's basic tools. You're only taking off the seat and the rear fender and like kind of the under fender, but I'm going to walk you through it step by step. So I said you need a couple basic tools. Let me bring you over and show you what I've got here. All right, here's all of the hardware and tools that we're going to use for this project, and all of the hardware that you need for this should have come included with your rack. You're going to need a total of 4 of these bolts, 2 of these smaller screws, 4 aluminum spacers, and note these are slightly different in length. There's 2 in one size and 2 in a different size, a little bit shorter. You're going to need a Phillips head screwdriver. You're going to need a 10mm socket on, maybe a 2 or 3 inch extension. And a ratchet. For the bolts themselves, these are a 5mm hex head, and these small ones are a 2.5mm hex head. You can use Allen keys. I kind of prefer these hex bits, and I use these with this little adapter here. One end of this is square, 1/4 inch square drive, and it is sprung. And you can slip these hex bits in there and use them on your ratchet, which is nice. I'll also link down below any of the tools that I'm using on this install. So if there's anything that you don't already have, you can pick it up for this guy. Let's see, other things you're going to need. You're going to need a way to drill holes through the fender. These are 3/4. So I'm going to use a 3/4 inch Forstner bit. You could use any kind of 3/4 inch bit. If you've got a 3/4 inch spade bit, that's just fine. I'm partial to the Forstner bits, as I think they work real nice in wood and plastic. But use what you've got. And you're also going to need a rubber mallet. So with that, let's get started. The first thing we're going to do is remove the seat. All right, so as I mentioned, the first thing we're going to do is remove the seat. And Honda's done such a nice job with fasteners on this bike. I said we need a 10mm socket, and every single fastener that we have to take out of this bike, with the exception of the 2 Phillips head screws, are 10mm, which is just super nice. So the first thing you're going to do is remove your seat. This is not the stock seat, but the removal methodology is exactly the same. On each side in this position on the bike, there are special 10mm bolts that we're going to take out. And what's special about these is they have an area, it's only threaded in the upper portion. There's a machine section here that goes in and tightens against, sort of like a washer, tightens against the surface but feeds through these plastic pieces. So set these aside. I usually like to set my hardware down in some sort of a tray or something so that I don't lose it. Nothing worse than spending 20 minutes on your hands and knees on your garage floor, or even worse outside and gravel driveway trying to find hardware you dropped. So once you've got these bolts out on both sides, the seat is a little bit tricky. What I generally do is lift up in the back with this hand, and then with this hand I kind of push the seat towards the back of the bike and then straight back. And the reason you need to do that is there's 2 clips here and then a clip up here. So you've got to come back before you can come up off the bike, so you don't damage any of these clips on the seat pan. And you can just set this aside. Next thing that you're going to do is take out these 2 Phillips screws, and let me see if I can bring you in for a closer view. All right, so you notice my fender is already drilled. I have had this on and off the bike once or twice before in the process of working with Jared to prototype this. Your fender is obviously not going to have these 4 holes in it. But next thing we're going to do is take these 2 Phillips screws out of the front of the rear fender. And note when you take these out, these are just threaded into plastic. So remember that for when you're putting these guys back in, you don't want to overdo it. And after you take these out, what you need to do is actually lift up on this. It's even though we've taken out the fasteners, the plastic of the red plastic here kind of snaps in place over the black pieces, the black risers that come off of the inner fender. So we need to pull up on that. And you'll hear that pop off. Now what we want to do is slide this as far forward as possible. You see, we don't get a ton of movement there, but it slides forward a bit. And that's because the way this fender is attached is underneath at around this point, there is a bracket that goes down and then goes in this direction and fits into a slot in this under fender. So you want to slide this as far forward as you can, and then you've got to kind of grab it in on both sides and curl the fender kind of up a little bit into this shape, and at the same time pull forward and then up. There we go. It can be a bit tricky, and see, there's the clip that I'm talking about, and it's actually fitting into sort of this underneath fender part. There is a slot right there. I don't know, I mean, I've had mine off a few times and I don't see any stress marks on the plastic. I think it's a pretty durable piece, but don't forget to snap those off and slide this as far forward as you can to avoid breaking that. And you can set this aside. Okay, so I just wanted to show you underneath the bike. The next thing that we're going to do is we've got to take out, there's 4 bolts that are holding on not only the brackets here that hold the license plate and the rear lighting on, but also it's what's holding this inner fender to the rear subframe of the bike. So we're going to take out all 4 of these bolts. And again, even though these are different size bolts, Honda was nice enough to give us 10mm heads on each one of these. So let me get you back with a wider view. All right, so I've got my ratchet, 10mm socket, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove each one of those 4 bolts now. And there's an order in which you want to do this to avoid dropping pieces. So what I do is, the 2 rearmost bolts, what I do is I just loosen those just a bit. And the front ones, I'm going to loosen the first one all the way out. Oops. And the reason I'm being careful here is there is sort of an aluminum grommet that sits inside that plastic between this aluminum piece and the plastic. So by keeping the rear in a bit, it won't fall out, and it actually, you can kind of get it to sit on top of the aluminum here and drop it off into your hand rather than chase that around the garage floor. I'm just going to do the same thing with the other side. So once you've got the 2 front bolts all the way out, you got those grommets out, you can take the rear bolts all the way out. And once you've got that done, this will come off. I've modified mine to not have all the plastic and lights and everything off the back, but the mounting points are exactly the same for the stock part. And you can set that aside as well. All right, now that we've got this lower part off, this will hang. It's not going to hang all that far. You don't need to support it. It kind of clicks into yet another piece of inner fender that's lower on the bike, so it's not going to go further than about there. Let me bring the camera in closer and I'll show you what we're going to do next. All right, so the next thing that we're going to want to do is grab our rack and just kind of get our bearings here as to where things are going to go. So the wider part of the rack should be pointing towards the front of the bike, and if you set this down on the subframe, the 2 holes at the back of the subframe should line up fairly closely with the rack. If they're out by a tiny bit, it's not a big deal since there are going to be some spacers in here. But in a perfect world, they should be basically dead on with these 2 holes in the rearward part of the rack. So what we've got to do now is install the bracket at the front that's going to give us a mounting point for these 2 forward holes on the rack. So set this part aside. Get your aluminum bracket piece that's going to fit in between these frame rails, and this is only going to fit through in one spot. right here where the subframe narrows, that's exactly where it's going to fit in. And we want to sort of hold it at this angle, tip one side in, just like that. And you look right in that spot, there is just enough room for that finger here to swing past. Just like that. And then these two fingers are going to fit underneath this cross member. So it's going to get snug as we get to that spot. This piece is actually, it's essentially sliding against the top inside face and underside of each one of these frame rails and sliding underneath this cross member here. So I'm going to push that back with just my thumbs, and that's the point in which mine gets too snug for me to just push back with my thumbs anymore. And I've got a little bit ways to go, and that's why I suggested the rubber mallet and the tools. And I'm just going to very lightly tap this back until I see the threaded holes in the aluminum bracket line up underneath these two holes in this cross member. All right, that looks good to me. So once we feel like we've got this lined up well, we can see straight down in those, it's time to go ahead and get these small screws in. And this is optional, but because these are so small and we're threading into aluminum, so I don't want to snug these down too far, I'm going to put a drop of blue Loctite on these. And even though the container is red, this is the thread locker blue. It's a Loctite 242. It's the removable stuff. So this is going to make sure that these screws don't back out on their own over time. And again, this is optional. But I'm going to place just a single drop on the lower part of that. And then I'm actually going to take the hex driver out of the ratchet so that I can feel that I am lined up as this goes down in there. Yep, and that's going right in. I'm going to stop short of tightening it all the way until I get this side in. Yep, and that side's lined up nicely. And we can tighten these guys the rest of the way down. And you just want to tighten them until they snug up. Don't overdo it. This is not like a 1/2-inch steel bolt into steel. These are small bolts and we are going into aluminum. So just till they start to snug up nicely. All right, grab your rack again. And now when you set your rack down on here, you should see that all four line up. And you know, ideally they should be right on, and mine look like they're all dead on. But as long as they're pretty close, you should be good, because there's going to be a set of spacers underneath of this. The fender is going to be sitting between the subframe and the rack, and that step is a bit tricky on these bikes. I put one of these same Scaggs Moto Designs rack on my Yamaha WR 250R, and it was a lot easier at this step because you could install the fender back on the top and then mark your holes from the bottom. This bike's a little bit weird the way that this fender mounts. If you recall, this side of it mounts at these two holes, and this clip mounts in here. Unfortunately, none of those mounting surfaces are available to us unless this is installed back up in a position. But if we install this back up in a position, we can't mark the underside of this fender from underneath. So I had actually 3D printed a couple pieces that fit into each one of these. They just sat in there and had a little spike on them. And then I pushed it down on the fender, and I ended up with all mine dead on. That's probably a little bit of overkill on my part. I think an easier way to do this would be to just take your 4 bolts and thread these in from the bottom. And you're going to want to do this on all of them. And do that until you've got about a 1/2 inch of bolt sticking up through the hole. It's a little bit tricky trying to do this basically blind. But what you're going to do is on each four of these holes, keep threading until you've got about, I'd say about 1/2 inch of bolt sticking up. And then what I would recommend doing is you're not going to be able to hit the rearward mounting points because you've got these bolts in here, but you should be able to get the front ones tight enough or get it to line up well enough that you can slip this back in to this rear surface here. Just click that in and then push down. Imagining I've got all 4 of these in here. Get this back up in a position enough that you can either hit the front mounting point or the rear mounting points. Probably, it might even be better to hit the front mounting points, and so it's just click in. And then push down with your thumbs real hard on the fender. And what you'll do is you'll make stress marks on the plastic, this side, pushing down on these bolt heads. And that'll indicate the location that you're going to drill these 4 holes. If anyone can think of a better way to do it, please go ahead and just comment down below. I'm all ears. I will tell you that the 3D printed pieces that I made that just set down into these holes with the spikes worked out wonderfully, but I understand that not everyone has a 3D printer. That said, if you do, by chance, I will also provide a link to those STLs for those pieces as well. Again, that worked great. I ended up with mine exactly dead on. All right, so the next thing that we're going to do is basically reverse the procedure that we followed to take this apart. We want to make sure that this piece is seated all the way into that lower black plastic insert. It's easy to tell if you're all the way in when you bring this up. Those holes should line up. And also you're going to have, so you've got a set of wires running to the back of the bike here. With this piece added here, you need to make sure those wires are sitting in the right spot so that they are not pinched. There is more than enough room between the bracket itself and this lower fender for those wires to be, but you just want to make sure that they are sitting in that spot and you're not pinching them anywhere. All right, that looks good on mine. So I'm going to start with the rear bolts because we can reverse this procedure and use this front piece here to hold those grommets in place for the front. And I probably should have gotten that socket on there before I started the grommet. Again, this is the 10mm socket. And the bolts for the rearward mounting are the ones that are a little bit larger. Again, all the heads are 10mm, but the diameter of the bolt itself is a little bit bigger for the rear ones. Again, making sure that we're not pinching anything. We don't want to go all the way with these. We have to leave ourselves enough room to slip those grommets in front. And one at a time, just slip them between the aluminum and into the hole. And follow that with the bolt. Side to the front. don't snug these all the way up until you've got all of them almost all the way home. Once that's the case, make sure everything looks lined up, nothing's pinched. Go ahead and tighten those up. All right, and the way to get this guy back on is basically the reverse of what we did before. So we're going to want to slip the front end, and we're going to want to bring these two holes here up past those holes in the lower fenders. Make sure you're inside, so this fender fits inside of the plastics in the mid part of the bike here. I'm going past as far as I can, and in one motion I'm going to kind of pull this fender up into a curve so that I have enough room to slip that clip in the back. And there we go. And once that is done, you pull it back and snap it back in to those two little plastic black pieces from your lower or inner fender. And I'm just going to make sure that my plastics are all lining up at my seat bolt holes. Everything looks good. And at this point you could reinstall your seat. I would recommend waiting on that until you have everything set with the spacers on the back. That way if you do run into any issues, you're not taking your seat back off again. And let me bring you in closer for this part. Should be looking through the holes that you've drilled in your fender, and you can see the 4 mounting holes that we've got on the bike now. The 2 rear ones are the ones that were already part of the bike subframe, and the 2 front ones are the 2 holes that we have from that bracket that we've added. And these spacers, these aluminum spacers, or these aluminum risers, are different lengths. The 2 longer ones are going to go in the rearward position, and the 2 shorter ones are going to go in the forward position. And then we can set our rack on here. Again, keep in mind that the wider part of the rack should be pointing towards the front of the bike. And just by hand, we should be able to start to thread these into those mounting points. And again, every bike is slightly different. So you might need to shift things around just a little bit to get each one of these started. All right, I've got all these started. Let me get my 5mm hex driver. All right, so with our 5mm hex driver and the ratchet, let's go ahead, put those all the way in. And don't go all the way in on just one. Work your way around. Bringing them all in together. Just about there. And keep in mind, you are going into aluminum, so you don't want to overdo it here. Those all feel nice and snug to me now. All right, let me pull you back to the wider view. Okay, so if you've got the right length spacers in the right spots, you should notice that the rack follows the line of the fender rather nicely. And before we put the seat back on, the last thing we've got to do is put the 2 Phillips head screws in front of the fender. So, Phillips head screwdriver. Now remember, when you're putting these in, these are going into plastic. So don't overdo it. Use the screwdriver, not your impact gun. Nice thing about plastic is it's got a little bit of springiness to it, so you don't have to overdo it either, just kind of snugging it up. The springiness of the plastic will keep it in place. All right, so do one last check, make sure that everything is lining up, all your plastics are lining up where they should be, from both top and bottom. And if everything looks good, the last step is to get your seat on. And seat procedure is pretty much the same as taking it off, just in reverse. The trick is to make sure that you're going in at an angle that you hit not only this front clip, but these two clips that are about 6 inches back on the pan. And just look on the bike. You see there's a clip up here on the fuel tank, and then back here, just ahead of the, I guess this actually is part of the airbox, but just ahead of the intake. So it is a little bit tricky. I usually kind of get my front lined up, and then I'll push down on the center of the seat. And slide forward, I'll bring in the rear. And what I'll do is I'll put my elbow on the back of the seat and just kind of lift from the center. And it should not lift in the center. It should be nice and snug. If it's lifting in the center, or you have movement there, you're in the clip in the front, but you're not in those two clips here. The rear, you want to eyeball that metal bracket on the back of the seat, that it lines up in both of these holes on the sides. If it doesn't, give the seat a little bit further shove forward. That looks dead on mine for this side. And same thing for that side. Again, thank you, Honda. It's another 10 millimeter. And these are the bolts that have this center section here, this shoulder on the top of the bolt. And one at a time. And I wouldn't go quite all the way. So you have both sides started. And these should thread in real easy. If you're getting resistance, check to make sure you're in the right spot. I think I'm actually getting a little bit of resistance on this side, so I'm going to back it off and just check again to make sure it looks like everything is lined up. Yeah, this one needs to go. Shove the seat just a little bit further forward. Try that again. And that should go zero one. And snug those up. All right, that's it. At this point, you are done. Take a step back, admire your work. There's a number of different things that you can put on these racks. I have one of the Wolfman Peak tail bags. I don't unfortunately have it out in my shop right now to show you. But in the next video I publish, I'm actually going to do an installation of one of the Givi. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. It's Italian company, Givi. I'm going to do a box on the back of this. And Jared at Scaggs Moto Designs actually sells a set of mounting points that attaches to this rack. There is a wedge that goes on in the rear, and there's 2 mounting points on the front for the GV mono key system. So if you're not subscribed, hit the subscribe button. In the next week, I'll be publishing the video for the box on the back. I can't speak highly enough about these racks. I guess I am a bit biased. I actually, the story goes, I liked this rack on the back of my WR250R so much that when I sold my WR and I got this 450L, great bike, but I wanted the same rack. And I reached out to Jared, and he worked with me to get through prototyping that bracket that fits through the frame rails to give you this front set of mounting points. And I could not be happier. This thing is on here just completely solid. I could pick up the whole rear of the bike, drag it around, buy this rack. Check his site out if you have not. I'll make sure that is linked as well below. So there'll be a link to the site. I'm going to link any of the tools that I used on this video as well. And yeah, hit that subscribe button. Next video I'll be posting is the installation of a box for the back of this bike. Thanks for tuning in.